ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਵਾਲੇ ਵੜਨ ਨਹੀਂ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਕ੍ਰਿਮੀਨਲ ਰੈਕਡ ਹੈ, ਇਹ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਕ੍ਰਿਮੀਨਲ ਰੈਕਡ ਮਾਫ ਕਰਵਾ ਕੇ ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਆਉਣ ਜਾਣ ਲਾ ਸਕਦੇ ਨੇ, ਤੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਲਾਏ ਨੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ।
They had a charge for PPT, which was stayed, but they made the mistake of going to the border and elaborating details regarding their involvement. And that guy, unfortunately, now needs a waiver for the rest of his life. And as you already know, waivers are generally good for 1 to 5 years. We had a gentleman who did bank robbery in the 1950s. And he's deceased now, of course, but he did robbery in the 1950s. And he needed a waiver up until the day he expired or went upstairs to heaven. And he literally went to the border with his waiver packet using a walker to file his waiver. Bank robberies from the 1950s. Two robberies from the 1950s. He needed a waiver.
He needed a waiver.
Yeah. So, yes, certain crimes do not require a waiver. But just to throw out something for your listeners, let's say you went to the Dublin's pub, Cloverdale, had a fist fight with a guy. He called your name. You pushed him against a wall. That crime right there does not require a waiver because it's simple assault.
ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਅੱਜ ਕੈਨ ਸਕਾਟ ਸ਼ਾਮਲ ਹੋ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ। ਉਹ ਇਮੀਗ੍ਰੇਸ਼ਨ ਲਾਅ ਦੇ ਇੰਟੈਲੀਜੈਂਸ ਐਨਾਲਿਸਟ ਨੇ। ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਵਾਲੇ ਵੜਨ ਨਹੀਂ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਕ੍ਰਿਮੀਨਲ ਰੈਕਡ ਹੈ, ਇਹ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਕ੍ਰਿਮੀਨਲ ਰੈਕਡ ਮਾਫ ਕਰਵਾ ਕੇ ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਆਉਣ ਜਾਣ ਲਾ ਸਕਦੇ ਨੇ, ਤੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਲਾਏ ਨੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ। ਜਿਹੜੇ ਹਾਰਡ ਕ੍ਰਿਮੀਨਲਸ ਨੇ, ਜਰਾਇਮ ਪੇਸ਼ਾ ਲੋਕ ਨੇ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡੇ ਵੱਡੇ ਜੁਰਮ ਕੀਤੇ ਹੋਏ ਸਨ, ਕਤਲ ਤੱਕ ਜਾਂ ਗੈਂਗਸਟਰਸ ਜਾਂ ਹੋਰ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੇ ਲੋਕ ਨੇ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਦੋਸ਼ ਲੱਗੇ ਹੋਏ ਸਨ। ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਪਾਰਡਨ ਦਵਾਈ ਆ ਔਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਯੋਗ ਬਣਾਇਆ ਕਿ ਜੋ ਜਦ ਵੀ ਚਾਹੁਣ USA ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਦਾਖਲ ਹੋ ਸਕਦੇ ਨੇ। ਇਹਨਾਂ ਕੋਲ ਕਈ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨੇ। ਕਈ ਵਾਰੀ ਤਾਂ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਪਿਛੋਕੜ ਹੈ, ਕ੍ਰਿਮੀਨਲ ਪਿਛੋਕੜ ਹੈ, ਉਹ ਦਿਸਣੋਂ ਹੀ ਹਟਾ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਨੇ। ਕਈ ਵਾਰੀ ਉਹ ਨਜ਼ਰ ਆਉਂਦਾ ਹੈ ਲੇਕਿਨ ਪਾਰਡਨ ਮਿਲ ਚੁੱਕੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ। ਹੋਰ ਕਈ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਨੇ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਅੱਜ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਕੈਨ ਸਕਾਟ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰਨਗੇ। ਕੈਨ ਸਕਾਟ, ਗੁੱਡ ਮਾਰਨਿੰਗ, ਵੈਲਕਮ।
Hello, sir. How are you? And thanks for the invite. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Last time you given very good information, and a lot of people called. I think they're also reaching you.
Yes.
So tell us more about how a criminal who is prohibited to enter US, you can get him permission to go to United States and come back.
Well, I mean, that question, it can be a bit general. So let's just say, for example, the individual has a conviction for drug trafficking, which here Canada is called PPT, possession for the purpose of trafficking. So if he has a PPT conviction, he will definitely need a U.S. waiver to enter the USA. But one thing your listeners may not be aware of is if he's been charged with PPT but not convicted, but at the same token, he goes down to that border and he elaborates on the fact that he's had this charge and starts admitting details of the crime where he was involved. He just talked himself into being inadmissible, and he actually needs a waiver. And that actually happened here within the past couple of weeks with someone. They had a charge for PPT, which was stayed, but they made the mistake of going to the border and elaborating details regarding their involvement. And that guy, unfortunately, now needs a waiver for the rest of his life. And as you already know, waivers are generally good for 1 to 5 years. So he's done pretty much for the rest of his life because the actual drug was powder. So.
Okay, is that correct that if the person is convicted, then the officer at the border has no discretion, but if he was charged and the charge was stayed, then the officer has the discretion. Whether he can, if he wants to, he can let him come in, or if he wants to, he says, bring the waiver. That's his discretion.
It's discretion actually for a charge and a conviction, because what happens is that same gentleman, let's just say that he has to get into the USA to see his mother in hospital. I don't know, she's in a collision and she needs a blood transfusion and only his blood will work or something along those lines. They do have what they call humanitarian parole. So he can get, technically he can get a humanitarian parole to enter the USA, to go to hospital to take care and see his mom. So they have a lot of discretion at that border. But again, people need to realize that what you admit to these officers can and will be used against you. And it just astounds me that the stuff that people voluntarily tell these officers at that port of entry, it's just amazing.
Mm-hmm. So is that true that the waivers are taking too long sometimes?
Yes. Right now, generally, what we tell people is 12 months or more. The problem is CBP tells people 6 to 12. And when you tell people the same thing, if you say 6 to 12, All they hear is the 6. They don't hear the 12 for some strange reason. So when we say 12 months or more, and it takes 11 months, then they're fine. If we say 6 to 12 months, and they say, Ken, what's going on? It's been 11 months. Well, I say, yeah, 6 to 12. So we really have to say 12 months or more, and that way they can mentally prepare themselves to basically block off that 12-month window where they won't even inquire or say, okay, you know what? I'm going to let that 12 months go by. I'm going to live my life, do my thing, blah, blah, blah. So these people, but the bottom line, these people really need to get some patience for these waivers being processed by CBP. They really do.
Okay, now things have changed quite a bit here. In Canada, there's a lot of unemployment, poverty. 25% people right now are living on a poverty line in Canada. If the person chooses that each time I go to United States, I'm being hassled, and he decides I'm going to move to USA, I'm going to live there permanently. Canada is not really a place for me. It's too expensive.
It is expensive here. The funny thing is the people who used to be in the industry that I just mentioned, they don't have as much of an issue with the cost here for some reason. They have a lot of money left over, I guess, from savings or inheritance or whatever. But the thing is, it's a bit of a misnomer if you think, not you, but people think that a Canadian citizen can go to that U.S. border and say, I want to move here. That's not going to happen. You have to be under the appropriate visa category. And some of these people in the media put this misnomer out that the fact that, oh, I can just move to the USA, blah, 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 because it's so expensive. That's not true. You've got to be under the appropriate visa category, whether it's business, family, or green card, or something like that. Investing, which is, I guess, still business. But the bottom line is you cannot just go to that U.S. border and say, I want to move here, because you can and likely will get what's called an expedited removal and 5-year ban, which is a deportation. So it's just too bad these other people put out a lot of misinformation on this. You cannot just move to the USA as a Canadian citizen. You have to be under the appropriate visa category.
If you get somebody a waiver,
Yes.
then is it necessary that the person has to enter U.S. within 3 months? What is this 3 months time frame?
It really depends on the situation. Let's say, for example, you're denied entry. Actually, that question ties into what we just said about moving to USA. Let's say if you're the border officer and then the Canadian citizen comes down and says, I want to move here and live with my live-in girlfriend. The guy has a girlfriend in Seattle. You can turn him around and say, well, no, sir, we're not going to give you a 5-year ban, but you cannot move here unless we know that you're going to return to Canada. Obviously, if you say you're going to move there, there's a high likelihood you're not going to return to Canada. But that officer can use in his discretion to say, no, go back to Canada and get proof of your ties to Canada, proof you have like a home, lease, mortgage, blah, 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 like strong ties. It's in the regulations. It states that the foreign national must have a primary residence in their home country that they have no intention of abandoning. So in that case, you as the officer could turn that gentleman around and say, bring back ties to Canada. Or you could give him the expedited removal and 5-year ban. So it's a supervisory discretion. But people got to be really aware when they go to that border. They got to be careful, what they say to these officers.
If a person committed a crime 20 years ago,
Yeah.
and he was convicted, and after 20 years, he straightened up his act and he was totally clean. He hasn't done anything wrong, not even a single traffic ticket. So can he enter USA?
He can enter USA, but he's likely going to need a valid, unexpired, approved waiver. Give you a good example. We had a gentleman who did bank robbery in the 1950s. And he's deceased now, of course, but he did robbery in the 1950s. And he needed a waiver up until the day he expired or went upstairs to heaven. And he literally went to the border with his waiver packet using a walker to file his waiver. Bank robberies from the 1950s. Two robberies from the 1950s. He needed a waiver.
He needed a waiver.
Yeah. He was like 95, 97.
Mm-hmm.
They don't care if it's 200 years ago. They'll say, you are inadmissible, sir, for the rest of your life.
Is there any kind of criminal conviction that does not require a waiver?
There are some, and just for the unfortunate part about this, there's a lot of these lawyers and discount waiver companies who reverse engineer our content to try to monetize it themselves, to keep their doors open and with lights on. So what I will say to that is there's something called September letter that you can get that CBP has designated that your crime does not require a waiver. A lot of these other places don't know how to get these, but because I used to work for the U.S. government, being a former federal officer, a former law enforcement officer in Washington State. We get people cleared based upon regulations, which we still have. So, yes, certain crimes do not require a waiver, but just to throw out something for your listeners, let's say you went to the Dublin's pub, in Cloverdale, had a fist fight with a guy, he called your name, you pushed him against a wall. That crime right there does not require a waiver because it's simple assault. Let's say you got angry one day and you went outside from Dublin's pub because the bouncer threw you out from Dublin's pub. You got angry, so you went to your car and you got a bat and you smashed his windshield, so you got convicted of mischief. So that crime by itself does not even require a waiver. So it really depends on the actual crime and the circumstances. There's another gentleman out here in Surrey, and he slapped an officer across the face. He does not require a waiver, but his is kind of tricky circumstances.
So anything else you'd like to say in closing?
Oh, I mean, bottom line is what we always say is when you go to that port of entry, you must definitely be aware of what you're saying to these officers because anything you say can and will be used against you. So it is what it is. You just got to be careful at these port of entries.
So what's your phone number, Scott?
Oh, well, people can reach us at 604-562-8140. And as you are well aware, we're about 2 units down from Dr. Chima at 7164 120th Street. So a lot of people know Dr. Chima here. So if you've been to his office, you're only, what, 5 seconds from ours. Yeah.
604?
Yeah, 562-8140.
ਜੇ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਕੋਈ ਕ੍ਰਿਮੀਨਲ ਰੈਕਡ ਆ US ਜਾਣਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਹੋ ਵੇਵ ਕਰਾਉਣਾ ਉਹ ਰੈਕਡ ਕਲੀਨ ਕਰਾਉਣਾ ਤੁਸੀਂ 604 562 8140 ਕੈਨ ਸਕਾਟ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਨਾਂ ਹੈ ਇਹ ਇਮੀਗ੍ਰੇਸ਼ਨ ਲਾ ਇੰਟੈਲੀਜੈਂਸ ਐਨਾਲਿਸਟ ਨੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਦਫ਼ਤਰ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਗੁਲਜ਼ਾਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਚੀਮਾ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਮੈਡੀਕਲ ਆਫਿਸ ਹੈ 120 ਸਟਰੀਟ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਅਤੇ 72 ਐਵਨਿਊ 'ਤੇ ਉਹਦੇ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਨਾਲ ਹੈ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਫੋਨ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ ਅਪਾਇੰਟਮੈਂਟ ਬਣਾ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ 604 562 8140 Scott, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for